Hello and assalamu alaikum. Thank you for joining me in the continuation of this series, in which I will be looking in this video about the state of the heart. Without further ado, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Now, the heart can either experience oscillation between spiritual states of contraction and expansion. Now, when contraction occurs, the heart hardens. And in today's video, I want to look at that and to discuss that and also discuss its opposite, inshallah. Now, in chapter 6, verse 1, in chapter 6, verse 125, the Quran says, and whoever he wishes to lead astray, meaning God, he makes his breast narrow and constricted. Haraj is the Arabic word for constricted. As if he were climbing to the sky. Thus does Allah heap defilement or punishment or evil upon those who do not believe. Okay? Now, in the previous videos, we talked about how when a person does not believe, and also more importantly, doesn't remember Allah through practicing what the revelation has been sent down for, then what happens, it opens up the person to be led astray. And of course, in those videos we talked about, the evil spirit being leading us astray. And that becomes one cause how we are led astray. And in this video, particularly in this verse, we're seeing how Allah identifies the heart by which this being led astray occurs. Okay? It is the nature of the heart to expand spiritually or to constrict itself spiritually. And this constriction here is a spiritual constriction. In fact, in the Quran, it's actually considered a disease, this constriction. Now, in chapter 22, verse 53, the Quran says that he may make the suggestions thrown in by shaitan, remember, the evil spirits, but a trial for those in whose hearts is a disease and who are hardened of heart. So here the Quran was referring to shaitan, meaning the devil, but generally speaking, it refers to every evil spirit that is appointed to any human being that turns away from the guidance and remembrance of Allah. And so in this way, God controls the human heart. This constriction or this being astray is a manifestation of a diseased heart. It's a spiritual disease, right? So one can almost say that misery or this condition of wretchedness, which is the opposite of guidance, is actually a disease. It's a disease of the heart. And for this reason, one needs to be aware of this, right? Because ultimately, every human being is looking for happiness. Every human being wants to be healthy in every facet of their being, right? Not only just in their physical form, but in their also psychic, mental, and emotional well-being. as well as, of course, their spiritual well-being. And so this becomes really important for human beings to pay attention to. That misery is a form of disease. Okay? Now, the word constricted, as I've said earlier on, means haraj in Arabic. And it's a metaphorical expression used for anxiety. It may also reference a sense of doubt or despair in a person, right? So this idea or this word being used in Arabic, haraj, for the term constriction, right, is really referring to this an anxiety, right? Even doubt and despair. This is why in the Quran God says that no one despairs except the unbeliever, right? This is why Ibrahim has said this as well in the Quran, that when when the angels came to him and spoke to him, and he says, is it that you despair of the mercy of Allah? And Ibrahim says, no one despairs of the mercy of Allah except the one who is an unbeliever, right? And this is a repeated refrain, right? This is a repeated refrain in the teachings of the Quran, where Allah says, and no one despairs except in the mercy of Allah except the unbeliever, right? Because then his nature becomes diseased. His or her nature becomes one of anxiety, right? Because God constricts their heart. And it becomes a breeding ground for these negative emotions of doubt and despair. So constriction of the heart becomes another cause by which suffering is born. Now, this constriction of the heart can make the soul feel existentially limited or small and worthless. A portrayal of this is echoed in one of Rumi's poems. He says that someone who goes with a half a loaf of bread to a small place that fits like a nest around him, someone who wants no more, who's not himself longed for by anyone else. He is a letter to everyone. You open it, it says, live. This is a very powerful poem because it conveys this sense of smallness, this sense of being, a sense of narrowness, a sense of being so small that you're not even considered worthy of being longed for by anyone else. You have no worth, right? That it's as if, someone who goes with a half a loaf of bread, that the bread is the staff of life. But God, he says that you only go with half a loaf of it. Like you don't even come with the full amount. They're lacking something. And this lack is exemplified in the idea that they go to a small place that fits like a nest around him, right? Like imagine the metaphor, the idea of a nest, a bird's nest or any nest, that a nest is it's constructed just enough to hold the animal or the creature, right? That is unlike a human being, right? When human beings are when we build things, we don't build things to fit just around us, to contain us. No, we live in mansions. We want to live in, We want to live in big and luxurious, spacious homes and environments, right? We're not contained by smallness, by a nest, you know. And so the poem is really acknowledging this constrictedness of the soul to such an extent that no one really cares about this person. They're not longed for by anybody else. This insignificance that they bring, it's not noteworthy. And in fact, it's a message, right? He is a letter to everyone. And Rumi is saying, open it. Open yourself. Because when you do that, the only message that comes from that smallness is you need to live, right? That this smallness is a disease. It's not rooted in life. It's death itself. And of course, death and this misery is because people's souls are closed off from God's guidance and expressed in the Quran as truth. In chapter 7, verse 179, the Quran says that many are the jinns and men. They have hearts wherewith they understand not, eyes wherewith they see not, and ears wherewith they hear not. They are like cattle. They're like animals. You know, the same type of animal that Rumi was discussing when he says, you know, you fit like a nest, right? In this case, implying like a bird who has a nest that it fits just enough around them. God says they're like animals. Like they're like cattle. Nay, more worse off, right? More misguided, for they are heedless of the warning of truth, right? So so the Quran has exposed these people, right? Has exposed the unbeliever, those who reject God because they reject truth. And because they reject truth, they have nothing to stand on. They're worse in God's eyes than you know, cats and dogs and pigs and cows and every type of animal on the earth. They're worse than that, because God says that at least these things know their modes of worship, right? They succumb to that. They do that naturally. But not so human beings who reject God. They're far away from the guidance that liberates them into the life that Rumi has mentioned here in his poem. Now, when the constriction of the heart occurs, it leads inevitably to punishment, which in and of itself becomes another reason for why misery ensues. In chapter 13, verse 35, we see Allah saying that the faithless will continue to be visited by catastrophe because of their doings, or they will land near their habitations. This catastrophe that's being referred to here is basically punishment, spiritual and worldly punishment, or worldly punishment that are manifestations of spiritual doings or immoral behavior or wrongdoing behavior, right? And God says that this punishment and this catastrophe will land near their habitations, right? That it will always be near them, right? And in chapter 5 verse 71, God says that they thought, the unbelievers that is, that there would be no trial or punishment. So they became blind and deaf. Yet Allah in mercy turned to them. Yet again, many of them became blind and deaf. Now, we know that God has threatened that on the day of judgment, that a person, that he will raise unbelievers blind and even believers blind. Believers, in the case of believers, that if they believed and denied God's signs by following them, that God says he will raise them blind. They too will be blind, as well as unbelievers. That God, because of their unbelief, right, send punishment upon them. And this punishment, right, resulted in them being blind. God says because they became blind and deaf, right? And that this blindness and this deafness is not something that's irrevocable by any means. God says that for some people, certainly in the time of the Prophet Muhammad and the conflict that was happening between the Prophet and the communities that represented non-Muslims at that time, in the conflict with the Muslim community, God says that there were some of them that God punished and God made blind, but then God forgave some of them being perhaps Muslims, some of them perhaps were behaving hypocritically, some of them were perhaps could have been unbelievers because God wanted to give them a chance. But God says that even when he forgave them, right, that they still, yet again, right, many of them became, as the verse says, became blind and deaf. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that when a person becomes a veritable unbeliever, someone who completely rejects God and rejects the remembrance of God and does not adhere to that, God says that the punishment then that ensues from that is that they become blind and they become deaf. And so blindness and deafness are ultimate forms of ignorance at the deepest level of the soul. And this ignorance is the soul's punishment, which is in itself another form or expression of this idea of misery. In a hadith, a saying from one of our imams among the Shias, who are considered the successor of the Prophet and the rightly guided, he said that not every man with a heart is with understanding, nor every man with an ear a listener or heeds the revelation, nor every man with eyes are able to see the truth of things. And of course, this hadith is backed up by chapter 22, verse 46, in which God says, "Truly, it is not their eyes that are blind, but their hearts, which are in their breasts." Now, what's interesting here is that the heart, and of course in the Islamic literature tradition, the heart is considered the seat of a person's understanding, right? Not necessarily the brain, right? and that is the center of all of his ability to understand and feel uh, um, all of life's full experiences, knowledge, etc., etc. And so the Imam says that even though that may be the case, he says that not every heart is with understanding. Just like not every ear has the ability to hear or eyes the ability to see. Similarly, the heart also suffers from that, this disability. And the Quran says that, it's not that it's not their eyes that have a problem. It's not the physical eye that's blind, it's their heart that's blind. Right? They are not able to understand. Right? This is the blindness. They are not able to understand the truth of the revelation. They're not able to accept it. Right? And this is because in Islam, the heart, as I've said, is the seat of a person's emotion and, of course, understanding, which, of course, includes all knowledge of their true self and of all creation. Okay? And so, by being blind, God denies them access to themselves. God denies them access to the spiritual bounties within themselves. Okay? Which basically is a true understanding of their nature and the knowledge of God. Now, misery and punishment, of course, is brought about by people's misdeeds. And the Quran acknowledges in chapter 83, verse 14, by no means, but on their hearts is the stain of the ill which they do. Okay? Now, this is important to be aware of, because the heart is the place where God constricts the human being. And this constriction is a disease, a wretchedness, a misery, the opposite of life. Okay? And not only that, but it becomes ignorant because God blinds it. Right? And this blindness is a source of punishment. But God acknowledges that, it's not God that wrongs them, but it's they who wrong themselves. And how do human beings do that? They do that through the actions that they perform in life, the deeds that they do, the unrighteous deeds that they do. And of course, here God says that it creates a stain, right, on their hearts, right? But on their hearts is the stain of the ill which they do, right? This is where this punishment comes from. This misery comes from people's actions. Going into this a little further, the Quran says in chapter 45, verse 23, have you seen him who takes his own lust or vain desires as his God? And Allah, knowing him as such, left him astray and sealed his hearing and his heart. Right? Remember, it's the heart that goes blind, not the ear or the eyes. Right? That the heart has the feature to hear or understand, to see or to acknowledge the truth. But God says that he seals his hearing and his heart and put a cover on his sight, who then will guide him after that? Will you then remember? Now, it's interesting here. What's interesting about this verse is it takes us down to the very root of the cause of our misery, in that God says that for people who take their own vain desires to lead them as their God, right? They're led by these vain desires. And God says that that is a form of idolatry, a form of polytheism, which Islam is diametrically opposed to, because Islam believes that there's only one God, and God is worthy of submission and worthy to be followed and worshipped. So God says that you see such a person, he takes himself as a God, right? Because short of taking himself as a God, the only other option other than that is you have to acknowledge your creator, right? So God says, in seeing him as such, God says that he has left him astray, right? And this being left astray results in his heart being sealed, where that the faculties of the heart no longer is able to understand and acknowledge basic truths and realities. And we're seeing this play out in their societies today, where you can talk about objective truth based on common sense, and people will just deny you because their faculties of understanding is so thwarted, it's so muted, right? It's so sealed up that they're incapable of acknowledging even basic truths, right? And God says, and God ends the verse, will you not remember? Right? God is hinting that no, you need to turn back to this remembrance, which the Quran itself is which is a name itself of the Quran, right? A remembrance. So God says, will you not remember? Will you not heed this remembrance? Okay, I want to leave it there for today. I want to thank you for watching this video, and inshallah I hope that it was beneficial. I will continue in another video continuing with this specific topic, and inshallah I hope to see you there. Thank you, and assalamu alaikum for now.